Hey, thanks for joining me. In this video, I want to think a little bit about how two different political systems can solve two different problems while using some of the same structures or institutions to make them appear to be more similar than perhaps they actually are. Now, specifically, what I want to take a look at is how both the United States government and also a state government, in this case, we're going to use Texas as the example, can think about using a legislature as a way of accomplishing some very important and fundamental responsibilities in a democratic political system, and yet they can design them or use them differently to reflect the different cultural norms and values or the problems that they're worried that they might have to face. Now, to start off with, I want to review really quickly, philosophically, why most countries in most states use some form of a legislature. Now, this is going to be true whether or not the government is very, very democratic, or even if the country is essentially autocratic. Most political systems nowadays use a legislature for some of the same very basic and important reasons. First, all political systems want to give the sense that they're somehow representing the people. At least Republican political systems do. Maybe not so much for monarchies, but even with monarchies, you often see the existence and the employment of a legislature. The idea is that by having a legislature and having a legislative body made up of the average people, it seems at least, whether or not that's true, that the people are supporting and are being represented through the political system. Now that brings us to the second point, this idea of legitimacy. It's important to the stability of any regime that it looks like they're legitimate. And one source of legitimacy is the sense that you have the support of the people. And another way of thinking about legitimacy is just simply to think about whether or not the people who you govern or the other countries or states that you interact with believe that you are in fact in charge of the political system. If they follow your law, that's a pretty good indication that they do. And if your laws appear to be legitimate, that is, if they're passed by a legislature, people are more likely to observe them and to think that they actually have some sort of force. Now, another reason why we have legislatures is to create the rules that ultimately will empower the executive and that guide the judiciary. Most governments are built upon the basis of some sort of a constitution, and while constitutions often provide framework, they don't often provide specific policy solutions or ways in which policies can be implemented. This is where the legislature comes in. The legislature is responsible for passing the laws that the executive branch is going to enforce, and that ultimately creating what crimes and punishments should be that the judiciary is going to be responsible for adjudicating. Now, finally, we also use legislatures for another really important purpose. We need someone to provide a check to the bureaucracy and a check to the executive branch. Now, bureaucracy, I'm referring to all of those things that actually run the government or implement policy, everything from the Department of Motor Vehicles all the way up to the military on the national level. These bureaucracies actually deliver the goods, deliver the policies to the average citizen. Now, in theory, the executive branch should run the bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy can become so large and unwieldy that the executive might not have the ability to keep an eye on it. Additionally, the executive branch might try to use the bureaucracy for its own political goals or political advantage and deviate from the intentions of the legislature. So we want the legislature to have the authority to keep an eye and form an effective check on the executive branch or on the bureaucracy whenever it's necessary. Now, given these basic philosophies, it's also important to understand that when legislatures or any institutions are being designed by the governments that employ them, that they're going to be designed to try to solve some of the problems that the country or that the state believes it exists. Now, on the national level, in the United States, the congressional system was designed to try to solve four key problems that the founders of the U.S. government, the authors of the Constitution, wanted to deal with. First, there's this general sense that they wanted the people, or at least the Congress as the representative of the people, to have supremacy. Now, I know this is controversial. There are many people who argue that the executive is a co-equal branch and that the judiciary is the same as Congress. But when you look at the U.S. Constitution, this is clearly not the case. All of the checks on the power of the executive that Congress has are essentially absolute, whereas any checks that the Congress or the judiciary have, that the executive or the judiciary have over Congress can be overridden by Congress somehow, either by overriding a veto or by working to establish new constitutional law. And so the national level, they wanted to have Congress as being supreme, and yet they were very concerned about the idea of popular control over the government. They were very concerned about something called tyranny of the majority. The idea that the majority faction of a political system would be able to rise to power, seize complete control over Congress, and use their authority to effectively take over and terrorize the minority populations. They're also concerned about this, the problem of factions or factionalization. The United States in 1787, 1789 was divided between North and South and rich and poor and big states and small states. And the national government, the authors of the Constitution, wanted to make sure that these factions could be balanced against each other productively within the legislature, rather than set loose on one another in a destructive way. And in this balancing, they wanted to make sure that the representation across the country was equally balanced, that no one part of the country, either it being a small state or a large state, or it being a northern state or a southern state, that no one part of the country would be overrepresented or feel like it would have no say in the political spectrum. Now, in the state level, many of these same concerns emerged. They were still worried about the idea of making sure the legislature was supreme and that factions would be balanced. But at the state level, because of its unique history, the state of Texas was very concerned about this notion of individual freedom. Now, individual and personal freedoms were only added to the United States Constitution after ratification, and they continued to be evolved into the Constitution for almost 100 years, both through amendment and through reinterpretation. But the state of Texas wanted to make sure that individual freedom and the idea that individuals could behave without concern of an overbearing or overpowerful legislature, they wanted to make it built into the structure of the Constitution itself. They also wanted to make sure that the lawmakers were not a special class of politicians set apart from the people, that essentially the people who made the laws also had to live with the laws, rather than being a lawmaking class or a lawmaking elite that could govern from the Capitol, but not actually have to live by the rulings that they made. So how do we accomplish all this? Well, at the national level, they basically do three things. The first is they create a bicameral legislature with power divided between the House and the Senate. They also think about the difference between popular control in the House of Representatives and state control in the United States Senate. And then finally, when designing these two bodies, they build them so that they represent differently. Whereas the House is supposed to be the more delegatory branch that listens to the will of the people, the general sense is that the Senate is the trustee branch, that it's responsible for doing what's best for the country and not necessarily what is meeting the immediate needs or wants of the average citizen. Texas had some different concerns, however, and therefore they're also going to come up with some different solutions. One of the things that Texas does that the national government doesn't is it creates an amateur legislature. That is to say that the representatives to the Texas state legislature are intended to be non-professional in nature. And there are a couple of ways that they do that. The first thing that they do is they make sure that a person who is elected to the state legislature has to continue to be a professional outside of the legislature if they want to continue to make a living. Wages for state legislatures are below minimum wage. And if you want to maintain your livelihood, either you have to marry into a rich family or you have to have some form of profession that provides you with income in addition to whenever you're serving in the legislature. Now, obviously, if you're going to have a second job, or maybe think about it as the legislature is your second job, but that also means that you're going to have to be able to have sufficient time on your hands to do that. And in order to accomplish this, the state of Texas's Constitution only allows the legislature to regularly meet once every 2 years and only for a period of 140 days. Now, in case of emergency, the governor can call a special session, but during these special sessions, the amount of time that the legislature has is limited, and the number of conversation topics that they can discuss or types of laws that they can pass are also limited only to the nature of the emergency, only to the reason why the governor has called them. So by doing this, the state of Texas essentially makes sure that you have to live with the laws that you pass, but it also tries to make sure that an individual citizen of the state essentially knows what the law is going to be and doesn't have to worry about the law changing on a whim every month or two. The only time you have to worry about losing freedom is when the legislature is effectively in session. Now, of course, having a state legislature creates a number of problems in an effort to try to solve the things that, that the state government wanted to try to deal with. For example, while the amateurs are in the legislature, the lobbyists continue to be professionals. The lobbyists who are trying to lobby the bureaucracy or who are trying to lobby the legislature have the entire time to prepare their argument, to make a case for getting from the amateur legislature what they want. What this means is that often the legislature comes into service not really having sufficient information to govern and depending upon lobbying groups as their source of information, which means that laws are often written in conjunction with lobbying groups or, in fact, based entirely upon the information that the lobbying groups can provide. Another question that has emerged is whether or not Texas has become too large for part-time politics. When the legislature was first created, Texas was a very large geographic state, but a relatively small state in terms of population. Its economy was also relatively small and largely agriculturally based. But today, if Texas were an independent country, it would have an economy that would be greater than many of those in Europe or elsewhere in the world, one of the top 15 economies globally. It also is a very resource-rich state with a very diverse economy that includes everything from technology to agriculture and lots of service sector jobs in between. The question emerges whether or not Texas has essentially become too big, both in terms of population and complexity, for part-time politics. Is it becoming true now that we need to have a permanent legislature because of the number of problems that the legislature has to deal with? And then finally, we also have to ask whether or not having this amateur legislature actually means that we have a non-professional political class. I mean, think about it in your own life. Do you feel like you could take off 140 days every 2 years and still keep your job? How many people do you know who could just simply tell their employer that I need 3.5 months off once every other year, and I need for you to let me go without taking away any of my sick leave or vacation time? It turns out that the number of professions that allow for people to be in the Texas legislature is relatively limited. Either you need to be a small business owner, you need to be a farmer or a rancher where you don't have as much work to do in the winter, or you're going to have to be part of some kind of a firm, like a law firm or a medical practice. And therefore, it's no surprise that most of the people who serve in the legislature fall into one of these categories. So in a sense, a kind of quasi-professional political class has emerged in this state. It's not true that every average citizen can afford to serve in the legislature. Instead, it's limited to a relatively few number of professions. Now, hopefully you had a chance to enjoy this video, and maybe you had a chance to see some of the previous videos in the series. If so, please keep your eye out for future ones that are coming. And until next time, thank you very much.